This is ContactTalkRadio.com. Consciousness in action. And you are taking action into your consciousness by tuning into Contact Talk Radio.
And on TuneIn.com, Ping.fm, and UpSnap Mobile.
Contact Talk Radio.
Welcome to What the Health, an independent approach to your health span. Have you noticed how our healthcare system may not have your best interest in mind? Join Dr. Eckel in this fun and sometimes disturbing exploration of the state of healthcare and what it means for you. Now, here's your host, Dr. Eckel.
Welcome back, everybody. I am Dr. Greg Eckel, and this is What the Health. And have you noticed that the healthcare system may not have your best interests in mind? Boy, now more than ever. I have my guest, Jeffrey Smith, back on the show, and with a great topic, the astounding evidence linking secret ingredients in food to brain and other disorders. And this is secret ingredients. So I am so excited to have Jeffrey on the show, leading spokesperson on GMO health dangers. He's authored 2 global bestsellers, directed 5 films, delivered 1,000 lectures and 1,000 interviews in 45 countries. This man is on a mission. He's trained 1,500 speakers and organized over 10,000 grassroots advocates. He is now sounding the alarm about serious, even irreversible hazards from new genetic engineering techniques, which can lead to health and environmental catastrophes. Jeffrey leads the global Protect Nature Now coalition, urging governments to stop releases of all genetically engineered microbes. Jeffrey, welcome back to What the Health.
Thank you, Greg. It's good to be back.
Yeah, I am always a pleasure. I love the work, your mission in the world. I'm so grateful that you're here, and you've put together an amazing platform, the Institute for Responsible Technology, which we will have all of those. I've got those in the show notes and in the tags, and I really want to encourage people to check out the work that you're doing and the advocacy. You and your team educate me on a lot of things that I never knew were going on. This one, we'll keep it to the topic specific and then kind of see where our conversation goes. But you have really put together some links that other people aren't doing. I think the guise of genetically modified organisms has been like better living through science. And it has not panned out. I mean, we see it in India. We see it in the United States. We see it globally, really. I think a lot of folks have the misunderstanding that, the golden rice component of, it's helping, we have an overpopulation and we need to feed people. And so we need to use these organisms. How do you start this out, for kind of a total newbie?
Well, I think to catch people's attention, we surveyed 3,256 people and asked them what did they notice in their health when they switched to non-GMO food. And they got better from 28 different conditions in significant amounts. Digestive disorders, for example, 85% reported improvement. Then there was relief from fatigue and better weight, so loss of weight, brain fog, anxiety, depression, allergies, and sensitivities. And we're still talking about more than 50% saying they got better from these things so far. But basically, from autism and diabetes, cancer, Parkinson's, infertility, gluten sensitivity, eczema, all of these things were reported getting better, or people reported getting better when they switched to non-GMO and often organic. And it matched hand in glove with my informal surveys at 150 lectures where I asked the audience, what did they notice? Including at 24 medical conferences where I asked them, what did your patients notice? So the sample size was enormous in those cases. But this is something that we see over and over again, not just in humans, but in pets and livestock. And for those animals, the lab animals that are force-fed GMOs and Roundup, they start to develop many of these same disorders or their precursors. And these same disorders are on the rise in the US population in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and the Roundup sprayed on them. And now finally we understand the plausible causative pathways. So it's not just correlational evidence, which would be weak, it's demonstrating that Roundup and GMOs can do this to the body, which can lead to this symptom, which is experienced in humans and animals, which is experienced in lab animals, and which when people get rid of these inputs, they get better. So we have now a pretty tight set of data, which can basically leave anyone convinced that one of the first things they have to do for their health is to eat organic.
Yeah.
The first thing. I mean, there's plenty of supplements you can take and detoxification, etc. But the GMOs and the Roundup can undermine the foundations of your health. And I wanted to wake people up to the fact that this is extremely relevant, even for people who are not experiencing chronic conditions, which is the minority of Americans. There's increased energy, increased memory, increased enthusiasm and mood have been reported. So it's not just for those who are sick, but those who want to be better.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I love it. It is so foundational to our understanding. I mean, you know, I think the hippies had it right with the clean air, clean food, and clean water. You know, it is so essential to our life. You've linked, so linking again for kind of a newer listener or kind of somebody new, like GMO, genetically modified organism, that with Roundup, they're linked because they're making the GMO, that type of crop, to accept more Roundup, more chemical farming. Is that right?
That's right. So there's 12 genetically modified food crops, but from a land point of view, the massive numbers are 6: soy and corn, cotton, canola, then sugar beets and alfalfa. All of them, the primary, or in some cases, the only variety that's genetically engineered is the variety called Roundup Ready, created by Monsanto, that also creates Roundup herbicide. Roundup Ready means you can spray the entire field of fully grown crops with Roundup. The crops which would normally die when sprayed with Roundup don't, because they're genetically engineered. The Roundup kills all of the other plants, the biodiversity, the weeds. It gets absorbed into the crops. It gets concentrated into the food portion, and we eat it. So you end up with both the toxin from Roundup and the toxic GMOs. Now, what's doing the problem? Is it the GMOs or the Roundup? Dr. Seralini of France tried to find out. He took rats and fed them Roundup Ready corn that was genetically engineered to be sprayed with Roundup and was sprayed with Roundup. And the rats had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage. But in order to distinguish what was the cause, he had 2 other experimental groups, those that fed the Roundup Ready corn without the spray, and those that had Roundup in the drinking water but didn't eat the GMO. All 3 groups had multiple massive tumors, early death, and organ damage during the 2-year experiment. So the GMOs and the Roundup individually and together both are leading to these disorders, but also there's a list of many more. We know enough about GMOs to say don't eat them, but we know even more about Roundup because more research has been done on the chemical. And when you talk about foundational, Greg, it blocks the absorption of minerals. It's an antibiotic which damages the gut microbiome. It can cause leaky gut. It can cause deficiencies in melatonin, serotonin, and dopamine. It can threaten the balance of estrogen and testosterone and other hormones. It damages the DNA and can lead to cancer. It's a probable human carcinogen. It is linked to birth defects and also epigenetic changes for future generations. And I'm just getting started. It blocks, it suppresses digestive enzymes. It damages the mitochondria. There's so many things that it does that we know about, so that when we list the 30 diseases and show the charts showing these diseases rising in parallel with the increased use of Roundup, we can explain the plausible causative pathways as what's causing this rise of millions and millions of diseases.
Now, I noticed there you were cautious with your wording around probable cause of cancer. Wasn't there just a huge settlement by Monsanto in a cancer claim case of billions of dollars?
Yes, you were very, very keenly aware of my wording, Greg. Yeah. So here's the transparency. I'm very careful about what I say not to overstate, because scientists, they're kind of overly conservative. They may say converging lines of evidence suggest it might be raining. I mean, they don't like to say anything definite. And so if they're going to talk to me, they have to know that I'm not going to overstate what they say. So I'm very careful. In the case of cancer, the wording is very specific. It was created by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is part of the World Health Organization. They evaluated and said that glyphosate, the chief poison in Roundup, is a probable human carcinogen. That's a class 2A carcinogen. They said it does cause cancer in animals because there's plenty of animal feeding studies, but there's not enough studies in humans, fortunately, to determine that it is a definite human carcinogen. So according to their definitions, it is a probable human carcinogen. Then during these Roundup cases, the juries were presented evidence which was astounding, jaw-dropping, shocking. We can share some of it. And they determined not only did Monsanto's Roundup contribute to the plaintiff's non-Hodgkin lymphoma, but that Monsanto had acted with maliciousness and specifically disregarded the health of the plaintiffs, covered up the evidence, and gave the false impression of safety. Wow. From determining on their own, telling their own patients, their own employees, make sure you wear gloves and boots and the proper equipment and masks, and then putting in a commercial on TV, someone barefoot wearing a tank top and shorts spraying Roundup. But it gets worse. What I've been talking about in terms of checkbook science versus real science, a classic example came out during the court case. Exactly what I've been talking about. Just vintage Monsanto. When they wanted to determine how much Roundup gets absorbed into human skin, which is a necessary test for the EPA, they took human cadaver skin, dead humans, and they exposed the Roundup and found about 10% absorbed, which was over 3 times the allowable level. So they hid that evidence. They never turned it over to the EPA, probably illegal. Instead, they took human cadaver skin and baked it for a long time in an oven. But that wasn't good enough. Then they froze it. Then they took this leather-like human skin, applied Roundup, and said, "Oh, hardly any gets absorbed," and reported those numbers. What? So this is the Monsanto checkbook science. It's like people say, well, how can a company put into the marketplace something that's so unsafe? Don't they have a conscience? Well, in 2017, I debated a Monsanto toxicologist on national television called The Doctors. And she said, with a smiling face, as a scientist and as a mother, I have complete confidence in this. Wow. So when the lawsuit forced open millions of pages of documents, I did a search under her name and called up the producer of The Doctors and said, Donna Farmer and I debated on your show 2 years ago. She expressed confidence, but now we understand what she said in public was very different than what she says in private. She ghost wrote an article on behalf of Monsanto, took out her name, took out Monsanto, and took out the link to miscarriages. She acknowledged that the exposure of Roundup to rodents could have caused death in one particular experiment and tumors in another, and even told another employee in an email that we can't say Roundup doesn't cause cancer because the research hasn't been done. So when the Doctor's producer looked at that, like, whoa, now we have the real story. They invited her and me back on, the Donna Farmer and me. Donna Farmer from Monsanto didn't come on, but I brought on the plaintiff, a plaintiff from one of these cases, and the attorney. And for the first time, the doctors spent an entire episode on one topic, and it was the dangers of Roundup and the cover-up. Wow. And then it got really interesting because soon after, the Roundup trial started, and then the layers of fraud became apparent. How they had ghost-written articles, paid off journal editors to retract articles, got their front groups and their front scientists to do their bidding, and all the while hiding and covering up evidence with such fraudulent research that one of their executives ended up in jail because he had transferred over to another lab to oversee the Monsanto research before coming back to Monsanto. That lab got busted, and it was considered one of the greatest scientific frauds in human history because they were handling the toxicological tests for 40% of the pharmaceuticals and chemical companies, and it was all fraudulent.
Wow. I mean, that it is, and I think I said this the last time you were on, is a crime against humanity. You know, Professor Seralani is one of my heroes. I was so grateful I got to see him in person with his first kind of live lecture in North America.
Nice.
Reporting this data. And it's like, wow, you know, it is, it's amazing that it's not just glyphosate, in that what he showed in his research was that the full chemical composition of Roundup is like 99 times more toxic than just the listed active constituent.
You're good. You're good, Greg. Actually, in the highest formulation, it was 125 times, but you're absolutely right. Yeah. So people, I just want to dismiss anyone still holding on to the myth that our regulatory agencies are protecting us. Do you know that the EPA does not require any test data on Roundup, the full formulation? They just require test data from Monsanto. They don't do their own. They allow Monsanto, remember, the fraudulent company that cooks and freezes human skin, they allow Monsanto to turn over whatever data it wants on just the glyphosate, which is a fraction of the toxicity. And so Monsanto does rigged research in their glyphosate. They use a version of glyphosate that isn't even used in the herbicide that's safer, and then present that. But it gets worse because we now know that chemicals can act as endocrine disruptors at tiny levels. And we know that the Roundup, for example, at parts per trillion, caused non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. What does the EPA do? They ignore 2 decades of research on endocrine disruption and say, nope, there's no low dose effects that we need to pay attention to.
Wow.
They ignore all of that. So how do they get away with their declarations? A guy named Jess Rowland was in charge of the cancer committee that was looking at glyphosate and determined, according to the EPA, at odds with the World Health Organization, that glyphosate doesn't cause cancer. Well, we now know from documents made public from the lawsuit that he was a lapdog for Monsanto. He was trying to get other agencies in the United States government to not do any research on Roundup and cancer, saying that if I can stop this research, to his Monsanto handlers, I deserve a medal. We have a letter from a former colleague who had worked at the EPA as a senior researcher for 30 years and had to stop because she had cancer. And she said, basically, it is obvious that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen, and you're not qualified with your master's degree from 40 years ago to evaluate it. And you've been constantly eliminating and changing data to support those companies that want their products registered. And you're working with this other person that if anyone in the industry is in the agency is taking bribes, it's her, because what she says makes no sense. So for the first time in your life, do what's right and name it as a probable human carcinogen. And she was ignored. He declared it was not a carcinogen in his committee. And then a peer-reviewed analysis of the research that he used to determine that was largely Monsanto's unpublished studies, and also a study that had been ghostwritten by Monsanto. They wrote it and paid scientists to sign it that came to the exact opposite conclusions as the expert that Monsanto had hired to evaluate. So when the scientist evaluated and said, no, it looks like it causes cancer, they buried his report illegally and wrote their own meta-analysis or review article with the opposite conclusion and paid scientists to sign it. And that's what the committee at the EPA evaluated to declare glyphosate not carcinogenic. It reminds me of what happened at the FDA when the person in charge of policy for GMOs was Monsanto's former attorney and later Monsanto's vice president, and ignored all of the warnings by the consensus of the scientists at the agency saying that GMOs were different and dangerous and could create toxins and allergens and new diseases and nutritional problems that needed to be studied. But no, the FDA policy written by Monsanto's former attorney said, we don't know of any significant difference, therefore no testing or labeling is necessary. Monsanto can put their GMOs on the market without even telling the FDA.
Oh, you know, really the slogan that comes up is the emperor wears no clothes. I mean, that revolving door for all of the agencies, I mean, it's just, Frank, disgusting. I mean, we're talking about human lives and profit. You know, I don't know if I shared with you, but about 3 years ago, I was sitting in I'm originally from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and I was sitting in a restaurant. It's an all-you-can-eat restaurant called Eaton Park. And I looked around and I just looked at like families, my family, like there's just obesity everywhere. I call it a food desert. No offense to folks in Western Pennsylvania, but the quality of information that's going down the hatch is causing disease. Like this is, we're gonna get back to the secret ingredients here. And I just thought, wow, this is criminal. We're treating people as a profit. Like how much junk food can we shove down the gullet? And then how many drugs can we sell them before they die? It's almost like there's an economic equation of what each American will make for big pharma and the big ag or chemical companies. And so I think this has got to end. You know, that's why I'm so grateful to have you on the show and your advocacy and education, because a lot of people, I mean, clearly we're not getting this from mainstream media. And why I created the platform that I did is that I can share with the folks and listeners of What the Health, and then they can share that with their loved ones as well, because, you know, we're not getting the information anywhere else. And so these pieces of the puzzle, you know, the promise of, so the link between GMOs and Roundup and brain health. So we're going to bring it full circle here. So we see that was good. We set the stage of how corrupt and basically worthless, unless you're an executive at one of these companies that is making trillions of dollars. They're not there for our health. You named the EPA and the FDA. What can we do? So what's the link, number one? What are you seeing with brain health in particular? I mean, you had a whole listing of 31, I think, disease processes. The list is probably longer than that. In particular, in the brain health front, what are you seeing?
Well, in the film that I created with Amy Hart called Secret Ingredients, and you can get that at my podcast page, livehealthybewell.com.
Awesome.
In Secret Ingredients, we have David Perlmutter, who's a brain guy, did Brainmaker and Grain Brain. And he talks about the link between, in his case, he was talking more about Roundup than GMOs, between glyphosate and things like Parkinson's, autism, MS, and Alzheimer's. And he talked about two different ways of finding that the case. One is that glyphosate kills off the beneficial bacteria, and that causes inflammation and leaky gut. And that inflammation in the gut can cause inflammation in the brain. So that gut-brain axis, your audience knows very well. Eating foods that have been sprayed with Roundup, which is not just GMOs, by the way, and we'll get into this. It's also oats. You do not want to eat oats unless they're organic. No wheat unless it's organic. No lentils or mung beans or chickpeas. No hummus unless it's organic. These have very high levels of glyphosate sprayed just before harvest to dry down. It kills off the crop, but it dries it down and makes it harvesting easy and planting the next year without any weeds. But then you end up eating higher levels of glyphosate residues than you would even in the soy. Yeah. So these can create inflammation in the gut, which can create inflammation in the brain. Now, there's also two other ways. Actually, I think you mentioned two other ways. One is glyphosate kills or stops the shikimate pathway in plants. And because Monsanto knew that there weren't any shikimate pathways used in human tissue, they claimed that, well, it's safe for humans. Well, they just had to pay a settlement of $39 million because they knew all along that the shikimate pathway was used by our gut bacteria to produce the precursors to serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine. So if we are blocking the ability to produce these precursors, tryptophan and tyrosine and phenylalanine, if we're blocking these precursors and we're blocking serotonin, melatonin, and dopamine, these are the feel-good molecules. These are the neurotransmitters that give us happiness, and we can understand now why aggression, anxiety, depression, these things can be on the rise when you're eating things that contain Roundup. But there's another one, and that is the mitochondria. Glyphosate is a mitochondrial toxin. I was talking to Zach Bush, friend of mine, and he said he could see under a microscope when you put glyphosate in a cell, the mitochondria structure just implodes and destroys. And there's published peer-reviewed articles showing mitochondrial dysfunction. So David Perlmutter said in the film Secret Ingredients, the brain is at rest 5% of the body weight, but it uses 25% of the energy. The energy is produced by the mitochondria. When you have insufficient mitochondrial function, that's when you can get brain fog. So now you have lack of appropriate neurotransmitters, you have inflammation, you have low energy, and you have cognitive problems. But it gets actually worse because there are certain minerals in the brain that are necessary for cognitive function to be at its best, zinc, etc. And glyphosate was originally patented as a descaler for industrial boilers and pipes because it chelates or grabs onto metals or minerals, and it doesn't let them go. So it creates mineral deficient Roundup Ready crops, mineral deficient meat, milk, and eggs from the animals that are fed largely Roundup Ready crops in the United States. And then we eat that mineral deficient food along with excess Roundup residues, which grab onto additional minerals in our bodies, making them unusable. And so mineral deficiency is one of the aspects, for example, of autism.
Yeah.
So there's another friend of mine, Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She's a senior researcher at MIT.
I've had her on the show multiple times. Yeah.
All right. So, she has tracked the hand in glove relationship between glyphosate and autism. So the link to brain health, there are many links, and I've only mentioned a few. But I mean, she talks about the vagus nerve and the pineal gland and whatnot. Her level of biochemistry is way beyond that of humans. She's out there, and she has a great new book out I'm in the middle of.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of evidence. But what's interesting is if you switch to organic and you take notes, what's your energy level, what's your mood, all your symptoms, 1 to 10, every day with the percentage of organic, the top of that column in an Excel spreadsheet, and take a look. People will notice it. In the film Secret Ingredients, we had people who were on the spectrum and no longer on the spectrum, infertile couples that had kids, digestive disorders, allergies, skin conditions, weight loss. But brain fog was very common. Almost everyone talked about the lifting of the brain fog. Wow. Doctors talked about it as common with their patients. David Perlmutter talked about it as common with his patients. So it is something that we can talk about theoretically, Greg, but I don't really want it to stop there. I want the people listening to give it a shot. And you talked about how much money our human body is worth to the pharmaceutical companies. Well, also in the film Secret Ingredients, the people that switched to an organic diet that showed these improvements, including a family of 5 that had 21 chronic conditions between them and they all went away, they and others talked about simply not going to physicians, even though they had kids in elementary school. One of the nurses at the physicians, they said, this is unheard of. You have 3 kids in elementary school and I haven't seen you all year. You're just here for your physical. He said, yeah, we don't get sick. They used to get sick. I talked to another family, they're not in the film. They were spending about $18,000 a year in healthcare costs. And then they went organic. It went to $9,000 the next year and under $3,000 the next year. And she said to me, we're definitely not spending the amount that we saved in organic food. We're spending a lot less. So we're saving a ton of money. So when people think about spending money, take your medical budget, health budget, mix it with your food. Take your philanthropy budget, mix it with your food, because you get to also create a healthier world without these chemicals and without these toxins. So that way we can reframe the importance of eating healthy so that you can't afford not to.
Yeah.
And then see what happens.
I love that. And that is really creating a new economy. Oftentimes that is the first objection of, oh, organics are so expensive. It's like, no, actually the alternative is so expensive. Yes. I mean, the childhood illness, it's like 54% of children now have chronic illness. Like that is the highest ever. What, like, well, what is the cause? Well, here we're bathed in this stuff. I mean, I'm still so surprised. You can just go down to the grocery store and pick up your Roundup. Like it's still sold everywhere and people are still using it, spraying toxins in theirs and the neighborhood and the community. Yeah, so it is. So this promise, I mean, obviously, yes, eating organics. I want everybody listening. That is the action plan. And I would love to hear back from you if you do this, implement it with you, your family, and get back to us and, get out. We're going to get the secret ingredients link for you guys in the show notes as well. And you can go to Jeffrey's websites. I put all of the places you can connect with him. Organics aren't more expensive. I mean, we've got to change the whole economy because we basically have a disease-sick society. So the component I wanted to make sure that we hit on, the promise of genetically modified or genetic engineering. So, what is the future of genetic engineering and what's the most concerning aspects of this? Because the last time you were on, we talked about the mosquitoes getting released in the Keys. Now, unfortunately, that did happen, right? We released genetically modified mosquitoes in North America with really no game plan other than, oh, this is going to help us. Where are we at? What's the future hold here?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned mosquitoes because we just finished a comment period on our protectnaturenow.com website trying to get the EPA to turn down the proposed release of mosquitoes now in 12 California counties and an extension of that Florida trial by 2 years, even though the company never released any data from the original trial. So they've been hiding evidence and trying to get more permissions. But your question is important, and we're going to shift over from food to an existential threat from GMOs. If you go to protectnaturenow.com, there's a 16-minute film that I did called Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle. It's my 5th film, but certainly my shortest, and it's fast-paced, 16 minutes only. And in the beginning, you hear about a genetically engineered bacterium that was created for the benefit of farmers that was almost released into the environment. And had it been released, according to the PhD scientist that was interviewed, it could theoretically have ended terrestrial plant life on planet Earth. We're talking not a catastrophe, a cataclysm.
Yeah.
Ended terrestrial plant life. We talk about another genetically engineered bacterium that, if it had been released as planned, could theoretically have altered weather patterns. We talk about the microbiome as critical for health, for humans, and for the environment. According to microbiome expert Kiran Krishnan, we outsource 90% of our daily metabolic functions to our microbiome. We can get away with only 22,000 genes in our cells, less than earthworms, because we draw on the 3.5 million genes that are part of our microbiome. We've co-evolved with that microbiome so that certain milk digesting bacteria migrate to the birth canal before pregnancy, before delivery, so it inoculates the newborn with the bacteria necessary to digest the milk. Part of mother's milk is also undigestible by the baby, not because it's an accident of nature, but it's designed to be consumed by the gut bacteria, because healthy gut bacteria in an infant predicts healthier outcomes for the entire life of that person and can be passed on to future generations. The gut microbe, the microbiome will help prevent disease, will help treat disease. It moves around us. It is part of who we are in such a big and elegant way that it's mind-blowing. And yet, if you genetically engineer a microbe and release it in the environment anywhere in the world, it can travel. We didn't need a pandemic to know that microbes can travel. It can mutate. We may not know that microbes go to swap meets and exchange their genetic elements with other microbes, even other types of microbes, other types of species. So now if you create a genetic element designed for one thing with well-intentioned, meaningful, thoughtful planning, it could end up in hundreds or thousands of other types of microbes, in hundreds or thousands of other ecosystems, including inside human bodies. You can't recall it. You can't track it. You can't guarantee that it's going to act in multiple generations later the way it started, the way it acted in your laboratory. It is changing the nature of one of the most fundamental and important foundations of life itself. So if you ask what could go wrong, if you'll see in the film, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, that potentially life-altering, planet-altering microbe that could have ended terrestrial plant life had certain conditions been met was 2 weeks away from being released. And it happened to be the subject of an optional experiment by some graduate student in Oregon whose shocking discovery in the lab, and I'll let you see it in the film, put the brakes on. But right now, gene editing, which creates GMOs with unpredictable outcomes, prone to side effects, very dangerous. Gene editing is so cheap, you can buy a do-it-yourself kit on Amazon for under $200. You can create a gene editing laboratory for between $1,000 and $2,000, and for the price of dinner, create new microbes every day. Major corporations are trying to create genetically engineered microbes to release in the soil by the billions and trillions. We're in a situation where we are on the verge of irreversible microbial catastrophes. So Protect Nature Now, which is the campaign that the Institute for Responsible Technology began basically this year, is designed to implement laws around the world to stop the release of genetically engineered microbes of all types. So keep it indoors. But even indoors is not safe enough for certain microbials, where if they were released, they could create pandemics. So we're also against what's called gain of function research, where you take potentially pandemic pathogens and make them even more dangerous. And that's also discussed in this short film, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle.
Oh, you have that there. That's awesome. I mean, it's not awesome that we've got gain of function, but it is, I mean, it's just flabbergasting. Like it is, I'm going to ask you at the end of this, how do you remain hopeful and maybe, you know, and passionate about getting the word out? Because it's like, oh my gosh, we were 2 weeks from total desolation of melting the soil where we can't grow anything. The gain of function, obviously, that's a big discussion now. You know, is it that these are then, the motive is monetary because then you can patent the discovery because it's new, right?
Well, the gain of function, I speak to virologists and others about this. There's a concept that if you enhance a potentially pandemic pathogen so that it becomes a real pandemic pathogen, then you know what steps it needs to go through in nature to mutate. And so you can theoretically create a surveillance mechanism to catch it. Now, it's never worked. No one's ever done that. The other theory is, well, if you can create it in advance, you can then learn to prevent it or treat it, create vaccines. No one's ever done that either in terms of using this gain of function. And there are other main means of preparation and surveillance that don't require putting the globe at risk. Creating, like as we show, a potentially pandemic pathogen that was as much as 24 times more deadly than the COVID-19 virus, and that could have theoretically decimated the human population had it been released. But under normal conditions, it is hard to catch. You need to be around birds a lot to catch this avian flu. But the genetic engineers are airborne, which is like, are you serious?
Right.
Everyone knows at this point, because of the USA Today report, there are thousands of accidents, more than 1,000 accidents, let's say, that have been reported in biosecure laboratories. Some of the most secure in the world, including the CDC's anthrax and flu labs. They had to shut down years ago because of accidents that were made, human error and other things. So it's simply tempting fate in a way that no one should allow at this point. So we want to implement these new laws. So when you go to protectnaturenow.com and you watch the film, there's an advocacy platform where you go there, click on it, put in your address, and all of your elected officials show up. In a single click, you've sent them a message. Then your media in your area show up, single click. Then you could put something on the elected officials' social media or your social media, depending on how we set it up. Each month is a different campaign. We've done a campaign promoting the film to media and members of Congress, for example, not just Congress, but it's available for elected officials in the US, Canada, Australia, EU, and the UK. So we've sent tens of thousands of letters and messages to them through this advocacy platform. We most recently did mosquitoes because we're trying to stop the release in California. We're going to be focusing on regenerative agriculture soon because regenerative agriculture holds promises that are unbelievable for the planet, including stabilizing climate and all these things. But it's all based on the working microbiome of the soil, which can be damaged or destroyed by releasing GMO microbes. We did a whole campaign on the gain of function. We have white papers and articles, et cetera, et cetera. So when you go to Protect Nature Now, please go to that platform. Take 2 or 3 minutes. If you have a little more time, customize your message. That's even better. And then while you're there, I'd like to encourage you to make a recurring donation to Protect Nature Now. We're a 501c3 at the Institute for Responsible Technology. And we need to stop this madness instantly. We can't wait. For 25 years, I've been working on the GMO issue. I pioneered the messaging on the health dangers. I wrote the book Seeds of Deception, which was the global bestseller. I trained people to speak on the health dangers, interviewed dozens of scientists and doctors so that I got it right. And we created a global movement based on that with many other players now. And together, we inspired 51% of Americans and 48% of the world's population to the correct belief that GMO foods are not safe. So we were successful in a consumer education campaign over 25 years to achieve the current tipping point that's underway. We don't have 25 years now. If we waited 25 years to stop genetically modified microbes, there may be more than 1 million different types released into the environment by then. And future generations may be cursing us for as long as they exist on our folly. Yeah. It's like, many people have heard about the release of rabbits in 1859 in Australia, 24 rabbits released so that settlers would feel more comfortable and at home so they can hunt the rabbits. Well, rabbits multiplied like rabbits, and by the 1920s, there was over 10 billion. If you talk about microbes, there'll be over 10 billion on a weekday. It's like they can travel around the world, not be limited to one continent, and influence entire ecosystems in ways that we can't yet predict or understand.
Yeah. It gets a little overwhelming, Jeffrey, on that. So, right, the time is of essence. Get over there, check out the platform. I'm a member and subscriber and big fan, and I think the ease that you've made contacting officials and really engaging in a democratic fashion of just at least having them hear a voice beyond just big money coming to knock at their door. I'm wondering, what have you seen the change from, like, have we lost our democracy? I mean, it's just kind of a different topic, but I've got you, and I know you've been really, advocating. I mean, where are we at with that? It's a little bit off topic, but I just wanted to have, that's what comes to mind.
Well, there is a corporatocracy, which has been going on for quite some time.
Yeah.
I get an inside view of how that works in terms of GMOs and Roundup. I get a sort of observer view of other industries, chemical industry, in general, the health industry, etc., financial industry. So I understand some of the mechanisms from my own focus on GMOs of how they infiltrate. And it's not just in the United States. As you mentioned at the beginning, I've been to 45 countries. And when I arrive at a country, local activists give me a briefing. And there's always an exact description of which ministries or ministers are captured by Monsanto. And I sometimes will talk to the minority of the committees that approve the GMOs, and they're frustrated and they want to pull their hair out because they say the majority was assigned by the pro-GMO government and industry, and they don't even read the dossiers we create. They don't even read the risks. They just rubber stamp the approvals. And I've seen that in Brazil. I've seen that in India. I've seen that in places all over the world. Now, what's interesting is that for 25 years, even though I did affect policies in many countries, in some cases quite substantially, my focus in the US was not policy, it was more consumer behavior to drive the marketplace. But with microbes, it's not going to be your shopping in the supermarket that's going to make the difference. So it turns out that the pandemic has opened the receptor cells of politicians and consumers about microbes. We are now looking for ways to see that something like this doesn't happen again. So that's in part handled by the stopping of gain of function research. It doesn't stop the natural evolution, but it can reduce the likelihood of a pandemic. But also, now that people are so sensitive to the microbial influence, it's not hard to explain why we need to lock that down.
Yeah.
And the timing is, on the one hand, we have the pandemic. On the other hand, we have gene editing that's now so cheap and easy. So we have an existential threat right here, right now, and the pandemic has created more receptivity. So it is a silver lining of this time period. And we're getting incredible positive reactions on Capitol Hill. So I'm going to DC with experts to give presentations, the National Press Club, et cetera, and meeting with members to convince and convey, to educate, to offer our services. And the feedback we're getting is quite good.
Excellent.
So I can't tell you if this speaks to democracy as a whole, but I can say in this arena, I have optimism. Yeah.
Oh, lovely. All right. And so let me ask you, so again, on these questioning, what motivates you, or how do you keep are you optimist or, you know, in your mood? I mean, you're getting into some of these existential crises, and I can see that could get overwhelming and just quite depressing. So what are you doing, or what's your viewpoint, or how do you handle this? How do you navigate that realm?
Well, you know, we have been entrained, whether on purpose or by accident, to give our power away to schools, to work, to governments, to media, to experts. And in fact, the epidemic that's allowed GMOs and Roundup and this wild west of gene editing is that, oh, other people will handle it. It's other people's responsibilities. I'm sure they'll do a good job. I'm sure the FDA is going to protect us from GMO foods, whatever. And this thinking is at the basis of these problems and so many others. But if we simply shift our thinking to say, I'll take responsibility. And if you happen to be one of those people that have an area that you sort of feel like you came here to help on, it's like your purpose, your mission. If we can get above our own self-imposed glass ceiling of feeling small and fearful and giving away power and get to the other side of it, then it's as if we have more resources available. It's the wind under our wings. And I've seen this so often because one of the joys of traveling 6 to 9 months a year for 13 years straight was meeting other speakers who also stepped up to a level of fearlessness.
Yeah.
There's no fear at that level. It's service. And so at that level, we're doing our job. We're doing our job, we're getting it done, and it's working. So, you know, I remember going into South Africa and 3 weeks later, they decided to stop imports of genetically engineered feed, you know, to evaluate its economic impacts on its exports to Europe, which was the subject of an article, of an interview in their financial papers with me. I remember going to Taiwan and, you know, having them soon after ban genetically engineered foods in school meals. I remember, you know, I know that we can make a difference. I have made a difference. It works. And this happens to be my area. You know, people have their areas. And so I'm more than optimistic. I feel like we need to empower ourselves and others. So it's not Pollyanna-ish optimism, like, which is optimism without responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, oh, they'll take care of it. I'm sure they'll do a good job. That optimism is part of the problem. The optimism that comes from, I'm feeling what it's like to be empowered. It's amazing. I'm getting stuff done, and I'm inspiring others to do the same. This is why I'm here. And then it's like, no holds barred. Moving forward will change the world.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Because that I know oftentimes people will get a lot overwhelmed with the topic and kind of put their head in the sand. And I love this empowering into action and responsibility and kind of that growth of overcoming your own glass ceiling and stepping into that service component. I mean, that's what took me into medicine. I found that path early on in high school. So you really articulately shared that point of view. So thank you for that. So coming down to the last bit of the show, I'm going to leave it up to you. I mean, that was actually very inspiring, but I want to know, so we've got protectnaturenow.com. We've got Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle movie. You've got the Institute for Responsible Technology. There's a lot of campaigns and activism on there. We showed The Emperor Wears No Clothes. We need to step up into our responsibility. What other things that would you like to share with folks?
Okay, here's the arc, and an arc could be given to others as well. Because some people listening may be totally on board, fully organic, activists, advocates, whatever. But here's an arc. Start at livehealthybewell.com, where you can see the movie Secret Ingredients. That inspires more people to eat organic than anything that we've ever seen. When they want to go to organic, you can help get support from a 90-day lifestyle upgrade or Healing from GMOs and Roundup Summit, which are there. But you can then go over to responsibletechnology.org and take a look at when you can't eat organic all the time, there's a report of the glyphosate levels in lots and lots of different types of food. So when you can't eat organic, you know what to avoid. There's also a list of all the GMOs. So get inspired by secret ingredients. Go to responsibletechnology.org, learn how to change your diet. Now that you've taken care of yourself, go to Protect Nature Now and take care of the world. Watch the film, go to the advocacy platform, make a donation. And then while you're at it, share it all with someone else. You can bring them through the cycle, depending on where they are. You can bring them straight to Protect Nature Now. Whatever works, we all know our friends better than anyone speaking on a podcast. And I'll tell you one thing about our friends. For those of you in the audience who are like the people that your friends run away from when it's time to talk about food because you're always proselytizing about organic, their eyes glaze over, they change the subject, they cover their face. If you want to go organic, you may not be the best person to talk to them about it. Show them the film. People have come up to me and said, my daughter would never go organic until I showed her. My spouse would never go organic until I showed her. So this is the technique you can use so that you're off the hook. Let us do the heavy lifting to convince people to go organic. And I think you'll find that it works.
Love it. I love that. Yeah, you're making it easy for the transition. So Jeffrey Smith, thank you so much for coming on to What the Health. Exactly why I created this platform, folks. If you are inspired by this, I don't know how you're not. Share it with 2 friends or family members, the video of our talk today. Get out there, give us some 5-star reviews on your favorite platforms and tell people why. What did you learn? And get into action. I like this challenge of, I'm going to put it out there, doctor's orders of, we're going organic, folks. So get it in there. I want to hear from you and let me know how it's going. If you've got hiccups or questions about it, you can put it on our Facebook channel. You can write into the clinic, wherever. Just get in contact. I'm inviting you to get into dialogue with us because this change needs to happen now. And we're it. Like we've been who we've been waiting for. This is us. So thank you for tuning in. Jeffrey, always a pleasure. I can't wait to have you back on for another talk in the future. Everybody, this is What the Health, and we are here on the Contact Talk Radio Tuesdays from 2 to 3 p.m. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.